Hi everyone! Here I am with the in-depth portion of Megadeth's song titled Holy Wars, The Punishment Due. And if you haven't seen my first listen, you should check that out. But I want to dig into the music a little bit and talk about some of the things having to do with both the music and the lyrics. Well, the music is really quite well constructed, at least from my perspective. There's a solid progression from one idea to the next. The instruments work really well together, keeping a clear, focused energy throughout the piece. And the slower, we could say juicier, middle section makes a really nice contrast with the two outer, I'll call them caffeinated sections. I mentioned in my first listen that I could imagine this music being played by a Baroque orchestra. I still can, but the more I listened to it, the more I thought of another very different work, and that is Khachaturian's Spartacus. Believe it or not, that's a ballet, which might sound completely off topic from this Holy Wars. But the story is based on that of the famous Roman slave who spearheaded an uprising against the Romans. And if you don't know the story, it's really quite an incredible story. Although it is stylistically and topically quite different from Holy Wars, The Punishment Due, and of course is much longer, there's also a certain kind of similarity between the two in the way they use repeated motifs, these strident tone colors, some of the chromatic elements that you heard me mention in my first listen. And it all works together to make this dramatic power escape. If you have the patience, it's worth watching the entire ballet. But even if you can't take that much, you should definitely check out a portion of it. Maybe go for the Revolt of the Slaves, which is about 40 minutes into the work, and then try out Spartacus's Path, which is the penultimate scene just before the final movement. I will put a couple links in the description for you to explore this music. One of them is going to have just the music with no visuals, and the other one is going to actually be a ballet performance, which helps to add another dimension to the music. Take your pick or try them both. Anyway, the solidly organized and presented musical content in this Megadeth song set me up to look for logic in the lyrics too. After all, doesn't it make sense to present a solidly compelling message if you have a good dish to serve it on? So in my first listen, I was trying to make sense of the lyrical content. You'll remember if you saw it. And if you remember, I ended up at the end saying I would have to spend some time and try to find out what this was all about and how it all linked together. Well, I've done a lot of reading about this song, about the band, about what inspired this song, as well as simply spending time with the music and with recordings of the music and reading the lyrics. And I've come to a conclusion. I think the lyrics are a hot mess. Now, before you take aim and shoot me down, I will say that there are certainly portions of the lyrics that work well and present a cogent line of thought. But instead of developing these ideas into something with some depth to it, it jumps around randomly to topics that have no logical link or connection. And so it fails to make good sense as a whole. The more I listen to it, the more it strikes me as being like some hot-headed teenager getting into a political discussion, but who is driven more by impulse and instinct than by carefully thought out reasoning. Even if his impulses and instincts are justifiable or could be developed into something worthy of listening to and pursuing, as it stands, there are too many illogical leaps and too many raging hormones to have any productive political discussion. Can you tell I've known a few hot-headed teenagers in my life? So, what is it that inspired these lyrics? It turns out that Megadeth was touring in Northern Ireland in 1988. Now, being a band of young performers from California, they were really clueless about the Irish troubles. And one afternoon before a concert, Dave Mustaine spent an afternoon drinking and along the way picked up some simplistic political information about the cause, having something to do with some disagreement between the Catholics and the Protestants, which he thought was kind of ridiculous, but okay. That evening, during the concert, he decided to throw out a comment intended to cater to the local audience. He said, "Give Ireland back to the Irish. This song is for the cause, Anarchy in Antrim." And the band launched into that song. Well, long story short, war nearly erupted in the audience on the spot. In fact, I read that fighting actually did break out. The concert was halted. The entire band was escorted out of town under police protection in a bulletproof van. That experience, of course, it makes a wonderful dramatic story later on. But it also served as the source for the ideas found in the first portion of the lyrics of this song, which is why we hear this opening of "Brother will kill brother," and so on. I'd have loved to see that developed into something really compelling, and I was looking for it, and I was expecting it. But then halfway through, we switched to something entirely different. At first, I thought I'd be able to find maybe a different angle, a different part of the story, something relevant to how the song starts, but if it does exist, it's so poorly articulated that we're left trying to make up links which simply aren't found in the song. And of all things, I found out this portion of the lyrics are inspired by a Marvel Comics character called the Punisher. Well, I can't say I'm familiar with the Marvel Comics, so there may be some obscure relevance which I don't know. But I can't find any reference to it either by way of the lyrics themselves, which is what we ought to find, or in what's been written about the song and said about the song by the band, by people who have spent a lot of time with this music. It comes out so very much like a 15-year-old's undeveloped writing, even down to the misspelling of where it says repel down the rocks, repel instead of rappel. I hoped it would get better as we went on, but it gets even more nonsensical. The final portion finishes with this unhinged monologue about the lack of mercy killings, and then the next thing you know, they'll take my thoughts away. What on earth does this have to do with brother against brother, or the ideas articulated in the first part of the song? There's no coherent message in the lyrics. So what's left to us? The music, of course. By now, if you've watched many of my videos, you've figured out, just as I have, that thrash metal is really not something that I connect to on a personal level. Personally, I tend towards music with a richer tonal palette, more colorful emotional content. But that doesn't mean that I can't appreciate good music in a style that lies outside of my personal preferences. And this is a very good example of that. Because listening to this music, it's obvious that it is well constructed. And as it turns out, this particular song is considered one of Megadeth's best. Structurally, It follows what we can broadly call ternary style form, meaning we have a first section, which encompasses, in this song, both the introduction and the Holy Wars portion of the piece. And if you listen to these portions, you'll hear how they are very consistent throughout. Then, after a little transition material, we end up at the entirely new Punishment Due section, which musically is slower, a bit more flexibly melodic. In fact, I would say the melody gets a bit juicier here, very obviously pulling in some stylistic elements which we could trace back to the blues, even jazz, and it sounds great. It's a wonderful contrast to what came before. Then eventually we come back to the musical topic of the first section, which is our third portion of the piece. So the overall shape of the piece is well organized. It's the same general shape that composers have used for centuries. One of the very popular musical forms that uses this design that comes to my mind quickly is the Minuet and Trio form. And I'm going to include 3 links for you to check out with 2 very different minuets and trios. The first one is by Bach, and it's played on piano in the first recording. You might notice that the first part of the music has a sort of repetitive, rhythmic, melodic figure, which in rock and metal would be called a riff. And I bet your ears will catch it. There are so many similarities. And then, once we've settled into that riff feel sound, notice the drastic change that happens right about 1 minute 22 seconds. It suddenly becomes a bit darker, a bit more emotionally flexible, and just a hint slower. And then, after making our way through that second section, the pace picks up again as we return to the original idea we heard at the opening. The second link is the exact same piece again, but it's now played on a harpsichord instead of piano. And I put it here because it's interesting to hear how the instrument changes the whole quality of the piece. And maybe, for those of you who love the electric guitar, you might like the harpsichord sound a whole lot. I find that some of my students really have to take time to become accustomed to it because they're used to the modern piano sound. But anyway, I'm really curious to hear back from you concerning how you relate to this kind of music and these sound qualities. The final link is by another composer, Luigi Boccherini, who wrote some fabulous music for string quartet. And I could get into that, but I'm not going to sidetrack us too much. This particular Minuet and Trio comes from one of those works. You'll notice it's a bit slower and more melodic than the Bach piece, but it still has the distinctive shift in musical mood and quality right about 1 minute 46 seconds. Talking about the structure and design of music, let me remind you that if you want to support me on my rock journey here at Virgin Rock, and at the same time learn more about music theory and composition techniques, even if you're a total beginner, check out my membership communities on Patreon or Ko-fi, where I am presenting a music theory course designed to take absolute beginners all the way to the point where you can write and arrange your own music, understand all music better, and even unlock some of these classical music mysteries. Back to Holy Wars, the Punishment Due. What do we find in this song? It's the same basic pattern that we've known for so many decades and centuries in classical music. And you might wonder, why? Why does it show up here? Because obviously, Megadeth is not a band that comes from a strong classical training or background, and they certainly aren't trying to imitate the traditional classical music. In fact, I assume that they were trying to be as modern and freshly creative as they could come up with. But the fact is, good musical architecture really is effective, and that's one of the big reasons this song works so well. It has a really solid structural design, and that's what allows them to be creative and present their musical ideas with all their wonderfully surprising twists and turns along the way, and have a great variety of sounds and rhythms and content, and still have such a powerful music impact. Whether they got to it by accident or by intent, this classic formal shape is, I think, one of the big reasons that Holy Wars the Punishment Due got such a reputation as being one of Megadeth's best. It's what enables us to experience the power and energy of the music without feeling like we're being buried under a chaotic avalanche of sound. If only they had been a bit more solid in the lyrical department. Anyway, that's if you care about lyrics. So there you have it. But let me give you a quick reminder of the poll which is running now in the community. Led Zeppelin is, as of right now, ahead of Rush with only 4%. So there's still plenty of time to change the balance if you want to. Do remember to write your song of choice in the comments after you vote, but pay attention, because we are getting a lot of comments, and Vlad doesn't count the comments which include more than just the artist's name and the song's name. The reason is it's too much to wade through a lot of verbiage in this poll process. And if you didn't watch my first listen of this song, you have here on the screen the link to go straight to it. Enjoy, and I'll see you next time.